This is an interview with Vera Coppard on Sunday, March 4th, 2001 at the Virginia Holocaust Museum in Richmond, Virginia. Could you please state your name and place of birth?
It's Ilse Vera Coppard, and I was born in Berlin on the 15th of September 1926.
And how old are you?
I'm 74.
What languages do you speak?
English, quite fluent German still, and a little bit of French.
Where were you living before the Holocaust began?
In Berlin with my parents.
Could you describe what your life was like before that time?
Well, we were comfortably off. My parents were middle class. My father was a doctor, and we lived in a very comfortable home on the Kurfürstendamm until 1933, when in 1932 my parents started the construction of a very lovely house in the Grunewald in Berlin, which was finished in 1933 and where we then continued to live.
What kind of education did you have before the war?
I went to an ordinary, what we would call a state school, and until 1937, or it could have been early 38, when I was the last Jewish child in that school and refused to continue going because, well, the last thing that happened is I was thrown down the stairs, and my parents agreed to then send me to a Jewish school called the Goldschmidt-Schule, which was the first Jewish school to have been started. So I have recently learned by a teacher who was the first teacher in 1933 to be stopped from working because she was Jewish. Her husband had been a solicitor, and they set up a Jewish school called the Goldschmidt-Schule. The son of that woman who started the school is living in America and collected stories of all the children who went to that school from 33 to 39, and a few years ago published a book with all the stories of what the children thought of the school and what has happened to them since and what they've done with their lives.
Was your story included?
No, unfortunately I didn't know anything about it, since he'd advertised in the New York Herald Tribune and in the Times, and since I don't read either of those papers, I only heard about it when I was invited by the mayor of Berlin to visit Berlin, and the person who was detailed to look after me was very interested in Jewish schools, and when she heard that I'd been to that particular school, she gave me the book. And that's how I knew about it.
Can you describe the background of your parents?
My father came from a very small town called Garz an der Oder, which was near the Polish border, and his parents were business people, and he and his sister grew up in that village, and my father studied medicine. I don't know where, but he studied medicine, and I think it was probably first generation of going to college. My mother came from a very middle-class family. My grandfather, I never knew my father's parents, but my grandparents on my mother's side were, he was what we called an apotheker, in other words, a pharmacist, and a very lovely man. His wife, my grandmother, died when I was about 3, and he died when I was about 8 or 9.
And your mother came from the same town as your father?
No, I think my mother's origins were from Poland, and that they came to Germany when she was about 2 or 3. I don't know a great deal about that, so I can't enlarge on it. But they were very a very normal, established middle-class family in Berlin who prospered and felt comfortable in Berlin. That was very evident from some of the things that my father said, even in later years.
What was the predominant religion in Berlin when you were growing up?
I didn't know. I grew up in a household completely without religion. My father had been brought up in a fairly traditional home. My mother hadn't, and I know I went to synagogue a couple of times with my father, but basically I was brought up. I knew I was Jewish, but religion didn't play any part in my life. And the school I went to was a Christian school, and as far as I know, it was obviously a predominantly Christian religion at that time.
Before the Holocaust, then, being a Jew did not have as much of a religious significance. Did it have more of a cultural significance to you?
Well, to me it must have had quite a significance. Why, I will never quite know, but my mother had looked for people to guarantee, well, I'm now jumping a bit further forward, but from 1936-37, my mother was trying to find ways and means of getting me and my sister, who's 8 years older, out of Germany. She had quite a lot of friends. My mother had quite a lot of friends who were Quakers. And she told me that a Quaker family in Philadelphia wanted to guarantee for me. I use the word guarantee because no country had opened its doors. There were conditions in every country and quota systems. And there was a quota system in America. So you had to have a family in these countries who would make sure that you wouldn't be financially a burden. And my mother said that this Quaker family in Philadelphia were prepared to have me, provided I became a Quaker. I think my mother, who was a very lovely woman, but sometimes also manipulated things a little, this was her way of my leaving Judaism behind, although it didn't play any real part in my life. And for reasons I'll never understand, I said, I'm Jewish. And I'm not going to change that. Later on, I did actually come over to England through a Quaker in Falmouth. And when I told her that story, she said that's quite impossible because Quakers never insist or make conditions for anyone. And I found that to be absolutely so, because I was very impressed with them and moved amongst Quaker circles for many years afterwards. So I think this was my mother trying to manipulate a little. But when you say about a Jewish feeling for Judaism as a race rather than religion, I think I must have felt that very strongly.
Did you have many non-Jewish friends before the war?
Well, in my family, we never questioned whether anybody was Jewish or not. It was a question of whether that person was nice and whether we liked them and whether we liked their ideas. In Germany, I mean, obviously, I don't remember a great deal before 1933 because I was 7 in 1933. but there was very little time for socializing that I can remember. It was really, certainly from 35 onwards, a question of the conversations were mainly about who had left Germany, how one could get out of Germany, what one expected would happen. Did we really think that Hitler meant us? It was a time where I can't remember very much of a social life. It was really a question, I don't want to say a question of survival, because we were not, we had enough to eat and we lived a comfortable life, but it was a question of wishing to survive in the future and therefore doing something about leaving the country. That seemed to be most in our minds. I mean, the architect who was responsible for building our house left in 1934. Anybody who had any sense did. But unfortunately, I'm sure my parents had sense, but they certainly didn't recognize the urgency. And I think my father was 44 when I was born, and I think he found it extremely difficult to think in terms of moving to another country, starting from the beginning when he was already middle-aged. So I think that had a great effect on them.
Do you think they probably thought also it could never get as bad as it did?
I'm quite sure that they did not think that. I mean, lots of things happened. We had a raid on our house in 1935. There were lots of indications that things were getting bad. But I don't really think that they got, well, nobody ever thought in terms of extermination. I'm not sure that that had been thought of by anyone at that stage. But from the beginning of 1939, that's really when things hotted up and got really bad. That's when everybody was issued with a Judenkarte, which is a Jewish identity card, a grey card where you have a J outside where you're fingerprinted, whatever your age, where Hitler insisted that every Jewish female added the name Sarah and every Jewish male added the name Israel. So in my documents coming to England, I was Ilse Vera Sarah. Not that that's in itself anything terrible, but what I find difficult to understand is that nobody seemed to realize the urgency sufficiently, even in this country. When I arrived in May '39, I was 12. I went to this wonderful lady, I called her an old lady of 64, I now don't think she was old, who had guaranteed for me. And I found out that the previous Christmas, Christmas '38, a U-boat crew, a German U-boat crew, had been entertained in Falmouth. And everybody said what wonderful people they were, the Germans were. Well, I couldn't understand why the British people in Falmouth didn't realize what that U-boat crew would be doing, since it was a port. And when I pointed that out, they just thought here was a kid wanting to make herself sound interesting. The lack of knowledge of what was going on in Germany quite stunned me here, because we had blackouts from either 1936 or 37. We had rationing from 36 or 37. Everything was geared towards the war effort. We had what was known as Eintopfgericht once a month, where everybody had to cook everything only in one saucepan in order to preserve gas. What was happening in Germany? Why were they insisting on these things, if not planning for war?
How old were you then when the Nazis took control of Berlin and Germany?
Well, I was 7. this was in 1933, just after we moved into our house.
Before that time, although you were very young, do you remember any experiences with anti-Semitism before that time?
I can't say that I do, but I think my parents would have been very protective of that, apart from which I think memory is the brain is a very incredible mechanism, and I think some things have just been completely blotted out, and other things like that raid we had in 1935 are imprinted on my mind that I can see them now.
What are some other ways that your life changed for you and for your family after Hitler took over?
I think the biggest thing was probably trying to make yourself invisible, trying to not be noticed, trying to do what everybody else did. I mean, I mentioned the blackout and the rationing. We also had air raid practices in 1937, and when the sirens went, whether you were at school or whether you were in a shop, you had to go out into the street and raise your arm and shout Heil Hitler, raise your right arm. Now, I raised my right arm or I wouldn't be sitting here. So, in other words, you conformed as much as you could so that nobody would notice that you were actually different. At one stage, my mother, who, as I say, was very much for assimilation, tried to dress me in German traditional dress. It didn't last very long because I didn't like myself in it. But it was quite ridiculous because I look dark. I look what is generally known as foreign. And in England we would say I look foreign. In Spain and Italy people ask me for directions because they think that I must be either Spanish or Italian. In other words, I do not look the accepted idea one has of somebody who is Christian. And so, as I say, you did everything, and my parents always said to me, just don't ever do anything that makes you stand out.
What were some of the restrictions that were placed on you and your family for being Jewish?
That's something that I find quite difficult to remember because actually I think until we weren't allowed to go to we weren't allowed to go to the cinema, we weren't allowed to go to the theatre. That I do remember. Other than that, I can't really remember any actual restrictions. But by the time it came, things really hotted up after 37 and 38, and certainly from the beginning of 39, by which time my memory is mainly about getting out of Germany, preparing to come to England. And I know whenever my parents had any friends around, the talk was always about who had got out and to where. At the time of the Kristallnacht in 1938, my mother was a very clever woman, and she somehow always knew when something was going to happen. And I don't know whether she had friends who could inform her of what was likely to happen, but that night, my father, who had his, he had a surgery and a sort of a clinic, that's an X-ray clinic, and it was on the first floor. He worked, his surgery was in a very working class part of Berlin. It was, all his apparatus were thrown out of the window. From the Kristallnacht, I don't think there were any Jews who ever went back to their place of employment. My father certainly never worked after that. And for a fortnight, as from Kristallnacht, roughly a fortnight, my father found different places for him to hide in the homes of people where the husband had already been taken. So my father spent a different night every night until he could come, until my mother considered it safe for him to come back, until that particular hysteria had died down. That I remember very clearly.
Did soldiers actually come to your house looking for your father?
Yes. And well, my mother said she didn't know where he was. My sister married, my sister's 8 years older, and she married in 1938, and in October 38, and she married somebody who was 12 years older and had an affidavit to come to America. And if you married somebody who had an affidavit, you automatically also went on that affidavit. So, but anyway, in September they were going swimming to a place called Stölpchensee, which was just outside Berlin, and they didn't return home, and my mother was absolutely frantic and couldn't find out for 3 days where my sister was. And what had happened is the Nazis had come to the Stölpchensee and rounded up every Jew. And they were in prison for 3 days for no reason other than that they were Jewish, and they were let out for no reason other than that 3 days was long enough to hold them, presumably. But these were the sort of things you never knew what was going to happen next. And the result was, of course, that there was tension, that there was worry, that there was fear, that you never quite knew what was going to happen. If anybody went out, you didn't know whether they were going to come back. And most of the time they did. But it was this terrible tension of what might happen.
You said that your father did not work again after Kristallnacht because his business was basically destroyed.
Yeah.
How did you get food and survive the rest of that time?
Well, my parents were, as I say, middle class, so I don't think there were any financial concerns. I think, as I say, I really can remember well, it's not true to say I can remember very little about that time, because, as I say, I certainly remember the synagogues burning. I remember going to school, and that was the Jewish school that I was in, and we were told to leave, but not more than 2 at a time, so that there weren't too many of us to be seen. The school was only 5 minutes walk from my home. And it was just, I think the feeling of fear was never left any of us, but you learn to live with that. But it's something that although you learn to live with it, you're always aware, and in some way, anything that happens then doesn't appear to be quite so unexpected. At the time of my sister's wedding in October 38, my mother apparently lost a bracelet and called in the police. And the police came, and the insurance was informed, etc., etc. Well, what my mother had actually done is she'd managed to smuggle that bracelet out of Berlin via Holland. There were people who were, I suppose one would call them in a way mercenaries, people who helped Jews to get some of their belongings out, which might then later on help to keep them in another country. These people did it at the risk of their own lives, but I don't think for one moment that they did it for love of Jewry. I think they did it because they were very highly paid for it. But there were others. I don't mean to say that was the only type of person there was, but anyway, my mother got this person to smuggle out the bracelet, and the whole thing had actually been a setup. That's why my mother had to call the police, etc., etc. That bracelet kept my parents for quite a long time in England. So, you know, these were the things. Or my mother had a fur coat, which I remember meeting this English woman who took the coat via Paris, and there was an arrangement that once she'd got across the border, she would send me a postcard saying that it was lovely weather or it was raining, whichever, and that would be the signal that she was out of Germany. But before that happened, my mother suddenly remembered that she'd put her name onto every one of the skins inside that fur coat. And it was a very tense time, to put it mildly, because, of course, had this woman been caught, apart from the fact that it would have probably been the end of the English woman, it would also have been the end of my mother. So that, and for my mother to be able to arrange to send things out of Holland, I used to type with 2 fingers letters for my mother, and after every letter, which were quite innocuous letters, but could have been considered, well, in a way, were a form of code, my mother, and maybe she was paranoid, or maybe it really was necessary, she would cut up the typewriter ribbon after every time we wrote, and it would be flushed down the toilet, so that it could never be found. And that was the atmosphere in which we lived. As I say, my mother, I managed to leave in May '39 with a Kindertransport, and I'm fortunate that both my parents came out. But the time that I really, apart from the raid in 1935, I think as a child I was not so terribly aware. That's probably not true. I was, of course, aware that what was going on, but the real fear didn't start setting in until about 37. For me and my family, anyway.
When your father's office was plundered, was your home also looted?
No, no. On that night, what happened mainly that they smashed every synagogue every window in a synagogue. They smashed everything inside the synagogues and they set them alight. They smashed the windows of Jewish businesses that were still going, and they caused as much destruction as they possibly could for anyone who they knew was Jewish.
You mentioned an incident at school where you were pushed down the stairs.
Yes, that was, I think it was 1937. Well, there'd been quite a lot of things because most of the Jewish children had left either to go abroad or to be sent to Jewish school, to a Jewish school. And I had been on my way to school. I had been pushed into the road, and a boy who was with the Hitler Youth drove his bicycle over me, and I lost part of my front tooth, which had to be only part, as it were, until I was 18, because not until then could I have a proper crown to be put on it. And shortly afterwards, I mean, this was a boy from the school I went to, and shortly afterwards, I was standing at the top of the stairs, about to go downstairs, and I was just pushed to fall, because, as I say, I was the last Jewish child. Because, again, I think German Jewry on the whole was very much for assimilation anyway, but there were those that were and those that weren't, but I think the majority were for assimilation, and my mother was very much for that, and she felt I was going to get a more all-round education in that school. I was fortunate with the choice of Jewish school, which actually taught everything in English, and it was all geared to your future life in terms of living it in an English-speaking country, and was a school that specialized in Cambridge entrance. But of course I was too young for that, but there were children of all ages in that school.
Were you aware of any resistance to Hitler's laws and restrictions?
I don't think I was. I think on the whole people were so frightened that it was more a feeling of having to conform than do anything to change anything, because it was felt that we were too few. That was the feeling I had, that we were too few to offer any resistance at all, and we would be got rid of immediately. I've since met people whose parents were involved in resistance and who were lucky to get away with their lives. I mean, some people were taken to concentration camps and offered if they left immediately, left Germany immediately, they could leave the concentration camp. But as I say, that was still in the, I would say, inverted comma, lenient times. It certainly didn't happen after 1939.
When did your parents decide to send you to England with the Kindertransport?
Well, I don't think anything much was known about the Kindertransport until the fall of 1938. I know that there had been moves from the, I think they were called the British Board of Guardians at the time, that was the Jewish organization, who had been trying to get the British government to agree to allow children to come into the country without passports, because there was really not time to get passports for them, and for the Germans to allow them to leave. And it was in, I don't know exactly when it happened, but the first Kindertransport that came out was in early December 1938. And the British government insisted that £50 would be paid for each child. £50, I think it's now said that you can multiply that by 33 for today's value. And my parents were asked to contribute for, I don't know whether they contributed to 8 or 10 children whose parents didn't have that money. So in December 1938, the first Kindertransport came out. I didn't know an awful lot about the Kindertransport, either as a child or in later years, until a few years ago, when I became a member of something called the Reunion of Kindertransport, which was started by a wonderful woman called Bertha Leverton, who had been asked by her grandchildren whether she knew what had happened to her friends. And that made her start an organization which has absolutely snowballed. Unfortunately, she's now decided that there are too many people who are no longer with us. So she's actually closed her part of the work down. But the World Jewish Relief and the Jewish Refugee Committee, who were responsible for the Kindertransport, are still very active, and I'm currently working as a volunteer with the Jewish Refugee Committee, who were the ones who were responsible for bringing nearly 10,000 children out of Germany between December 1938 and September 1939.
Do you know why your parents decided to send you to England rather than stay in Germany?
Well, my parents, by that time, I think everybody realized they had to leave. And my parents didn't know how they were going to get out, because there wasn't a country that opened its doors. I think Shanghai was one of the places where you could go without too much difficulty. So both my parents had tickets for Shanghai, if nothing else came up. America was out because my parents couldn't get onto the affidavit, couldn't get an affidavit, so they, because my sister hadn't been in America long enough to be able to guarantee for them, and she had got out with her husband because an aunt of his was in America and had guaranteed. So my parents, like all parents, or many parents at that time, didn't want to go into the totally unknown with a child if there was a possibility of getting anywhere else, either for their children or for themselves. And so they decided to approach the, as I say, I can't remember exactly what it was called at that time, but I think it was the Board of Guardians, and got me onto the Kindertransport. And subsequently, both my mother came out in August 39 and my father on the 1st of September 39.
Were passports required?
My parents had to have passports, yes, but the British government waived the requirement, and I have just recently, through the Jewish Refugee Committee, about 4 years ago, I managed to get my, they called it an identity card. It was actually the visa that was granted to me to come into England, which I'd never seen. And apparently it would have been given to the one adult who accompanied these 100 children.
Did any of the parents accompany their children?
No, they weren't allowed to. It was literally a Kindertransport, and it was different in every town what parents were allowed to do. I mean, in Berlin, only one parent was allowed to accompany each child to the station, and my mother couldn't bear that, the thought of taking me to the train, so she stayed at home. I made my goodbyes to her, and she of course said she would be in England, which in fact she was, but that she would be in England on her birthday, which was the 9th of August, and she arrived on the 8th. But parents, again, I didn't know it at the time, but I have since heard parents all made promises to their children that this was a holiday, that they were going to have a wonderful time, that they were all going to meet up together. But sadly and tragically, the majority of them didn't. I was very lucky. But my father took me to this large hall at the station, and I think it was on a day when Mussolini was expected in Berlin, because the whole of Berlin was bedecked with the flag, the Italian flag and the swastika, and that was my last view of Berlin. But my father took me to this hall and was allowed to stay with me and these, what we thought were 100 children, and we were all given a number, and when it came to 100, that was that. And suddenly a woman became quite hysterical, because the name of her 2 children who were with her, the names were not called. And she became quite hysterical. And this is a memory that never leaves me. There was a brown shirt standing in each of the 4 corners of the room. They each had an Alsatian. And they just set the Alsatians on her.
Is that a dog?
Yes. And we were then quickly hustled out of, we then had to make very quick goodbyes of our parents. In Berlin, no parent was allowed on the platform. So we made very quick goodbyes, My father had a receptionist who was Gentile and married to one of his patients. The son of the first marriage of this man was in the Hitler Youth, and he had threatened this woman who was a receptionist to my father, but had actually been my nanny until I was about 3.5 or 4, by which time my parents had decided that she was spoiling me rotten, and they were very fond of her, and so she was trained to become my father's help. And she came onto the platform. They said no Jews on the platform. Well, she wasn't Jewish. And she had wanted to give me a bag of oranges, but in the rush to get us on the trains, that was forgotten. So here she was standing on the platform with these oranges. And she wasn't allowed to touch us, so she wasn't allowed to hand me the oranges. So here she was throwing oranges into the carriage with all of us trying to catch them. And I'm sorry. The train left. It was like an overground train which stopped in different parts of Germany. And the rules were different in different parts. And first of all, it also went to the outer suburbs of Berlin. And parents knew where the train was going to stop. So those parents who hadn't been able to come with their children had taken a car or a taxi to go to that next station. And there again, they were not allowed to hold their children's hands. And these outstretched arms of the children and the outstretched arms of the parents are something that will never be gone from my mind. And since then, when I've seen documentaries of people going to concentration camps, and again, having these, when it was already known that these concentration camps were extermination camps, these outstretched hands, whenever I see them on a documentary, just brings all that back. I was only so grateful that my parents didn't, either didn't know or didn't want to see each stage of the journey. So I didn't have that experience for myself, but the memory of it is something that I will never forget. And then I arrived in England. I mean, the carriage was sort of sealed, and there was a tense moment when they came through when the Nazis came through to look at papers, and nobody knew whether they would be turned off the train or not, because that could also happen. Fortunately, it didn't happen on my particular journey to any of us. And we arrived at Harwich, and we then came up to London. And I then had to. There was somebody, presumably from the organization, the Kindertransport organization, who was to take me to the train, because we arrived at Liverpool Street, to take me to the train to Paddington to get down to Cornwall to meet Marion Wilmore, my 64-year-old unmarried guarantor. And I think it was quite something for someone of that age to take on a teenager from a completely different culture. And I remember we passed a policeman on the way, and I just cringed.
Did any of your friends go with you on the train?
No. But I have since, about 2 years ago, I put a notice into the journal, which was brought out by the Reunion of Kindertransport, asking for whether any of the other, of the 99 children, what had happened to them, and whether they would, if they saw this notice, would they write to me. And one wrote from Sao Paulo, one wrote from New York, one contacted me who'd been at school with me. She and her twin sister had been at school with me in Falmouth. And one was had been a fairly close neighbor who I had no idea that either she was Jewish or that she'd come from Germany. And yet we'd lived in the same area in Maida Vale for several years. One of the legacies also of all this is, as I said, I cringed when I saw a policeman. For many years, anyone in uniform, I would shrink and would fear. And when in 1955 my older daughter Sandra was 5 years old and her tricycle was stolen, and I had to go to the police, I had to, my husband came with me, but he insisted that I went because he was trying for me to overcome this fear. I had a terrible fear of authority of anyone in uniform. And in 1994, I think it was, when I went with Sandra and her husband to Berlin to show them where I'd grown up, and we were going on the S-Bahn, and Sandra had put her, she'd taken her shoes off, but she'd put her feet on the seat in the train opposite. And he wasn't a policeman, I think they were sort of like traffic police, they were in a green uniform, came through with an Alsatian and said in German, and very sort of strong, "Take your feet off." I absolutely froze. So here we were, 1994, and it was still, it still had an effect on me. It was very frightening. Although I have to say that I sometimes wish people would stop young people putting their feet in shoes in the tube on the seat opposite. But this happening in Germany, again, as I say, brought all these memories back.
What were you allowed to take with you to England?
One suitcase. One suitcase, I believe it was not allowed to measure more than 24 inches, and it was not to contain anything of value other than one knife, one fork, and one spoon in silver. I can't actually remember ever having taken that, but I probably did and didn't recognize its significance at the time. Many Jews didn't have any more than that in any case, because, and again my mother got wind of this before it happened, on the 1st of January 1939, Jews were asked to give up every piece of jewelry and every piece of gold or silver that they possessed, except one knife, one fork, and one spoon. And you had people literally queuing at the offices to give these things up. And it was no good trying to hide something because they had the insurance lists. And as I say, I don't really think anybody had anything of value. My parents certainly seemed to come over to England with certainly nothing of any value, because that all had to be left behind.
How did you prepare to leave? Did your parents tell you anything to help you?
Well, I was upset about the most ridiculous thing. I knew that this Marion Wilmore was a vegetarian. I wasn't a very big eater at the best of times, but I did like meat. And the thought of going into the house of a vegetarian really upset me. And so that in terms of preparation, I knew I was going into the house of an older, of a quite elderly person. But I think basically parents tried to make light. I'm not sure the parents prepared any of us, because our everyday lives continued until the day that we were leaving. I was actually supposed to go in April, and then I was suddenly ill, and my father thought it might be an appendix problem, and so he decided that it would be better if I were operated in Germany, where he could keep an eye on it, rather than once I was away from home. And so my journey was delayed by about a month. I just remember being my parents trying to make as nice things for me to eat, and keep me as happy as they could, to try not to remember that we were leaving. My sister had already left. She had gone to America in, I think it was in the beginning of 39 or the end of 38, I can't quite remember. And parents tended to make their children think of it as an adventure, a new life, an exciting new life that they were offering us, where they were going to join us later. As I say, I was one of the few fortunate ones where that was the case, but again, that was really only through my mother that my parents came out of Berlin.
As you were traveling to England, were there any incidents along the way, or did things go smoothly?
No, I can't remember any other than what I've already mentioned. And I think they were so profound that they obliterated any other memory. I mean, to this day, I have great difficulty with large dogs, and particularly Alsatians. And a few months ago, my younger daughter, Julia, who decided to get herself a German Shepherd, and asked me whether and said that she wouldn't do that if it meant that I would not come to her house because I would be too frightened. But I decided if that's really what she wanted, well, I would have to try and deal with it. And I think her dog and I have not exactly become friends, but I no longer fear her, whereas I think if she started barking, I probably would, because that happened only a few months ago in somebody else's home when I wanted to return a book I'd borrowed, and there was this Alsatian in the window barking. And I said, when my friend opened the door, I said, "I'm sorry, I can't come in unless you shut the dog in the room, because I'm afraid."
Do you know approximately how many children were transported between 1938 and 1939?
Yes, just under 10,000.
Were they all from the Berlin area?
Were they all from?
From Berlin or from Germany?
No, they were all from Germany, but because this organization dealt with the whole of Germany, and later, I think also with Czechoslovakia, and, well, certainly with Austria, from, I think, 37 or 38 onwards, that Austria was annexed anyway, and so they had a lot of children also from Austria. But there were also quite a lot of young people eventually from Czechoslovakia and Poland.
Could you describe your arrival in England?
Yes, as I mentioned, I had to then be taken to another station, which must have been Paddington, since that's the station. We arrived in Liverpool Street, and in fact, there's now going to be a memorial at Liverpool Street Station. An artist has been commissioned, and she is going to have a huge glass suitcase in which there's going to be all kinds of documents and things that were dear to children that they now as adults feel they can part with, like the Judenkarte, which I feel I can't part with because my children want to have it, or one person had a particular teddy bear. All these things will go into that glass suitcase at Liverpool Street Station. But anyway, I was taken to what I presume was Paddington, and I did the journey by myself once I'd been to Truro, once I'd been put on the train. I had a little English because I'd been to that school where everything was taught in English, but I know that I made some pretty awful mistakes, but people were very kind. And then I was met by this very quaint-looking woman who, I remember she had a center parting, and she must have had very long hair because she had like two plaits which were circled round her and were like two huge earphones. She looked very old-fashioned, and she had a very old-fashioned view, but she was a marvelous, marvelous woman. And she met me in Truro because there was no, I didn't have to change trains. And then she took me from Truro to Falmouth, where her home was.
How did you adjust to a new culture and a new language without your parents to help you?
With a certain amount of difficulty and with a certain amount of being teased at school. I remember wanting to ask about the injection that was once a week, which turned out to be an inspection, and of course everybody roared with laughter. Or I couldn't understand why there were so many flies, and I called them fleas. Those are the things I remember because other kids teased me about it. It took time. It wasn't easy, but I think as children you adjust. I mean, I'm sure I know I adjusted much more easily than my parents, who certainly found it very difficult. I mean, I mentioned that my father was 44 when I was born. My mother was 36. So here we are, another 13 years beyond that. So my parents were middle-aged, and it must have been very difficult for them. The reason why I still remember and speak German as well as I do is because both my parents spoke English with such dreadful accents that I'm afraid I should have helped them with the English, but I don't suppose I did. I spoke to them in German instead, and that in a way of course helps to keep the language, which I would not speak German or teach my children German, which I now realize was very foolish, but I couldn't get myself to either, when we went on holiday, to speak to any Germans until 1964. I remember that year particularly because we met some people who did turn out to be extremely nice in spite of the fact that they were German. And so I overcame my antipathy to speak to Germans or to speak German. And the teacher at my children's school couldn't understand why they didn't speak, why they didn't learn German any faster than any of the other children. And I had to explain that they had no help at home. But I've long overcome, as I say, in the late 60s, I overcame all that because German is a very useful language, and that's a hang-up I haven't got anymore.
Could you describe where you lived, what the living conditions were like? With the Quaker?
With the Quaker. She lived in a very nice little house in the garden, and we weren't far from the sea. I would say she was not very comfortably off, but she was a person who gave a great deal of herself, and who certainly tried to make my stay with her as comfortable and as happy as she possibly could. the first Sunday I was there, she said that she goes to Quaker meetings. I could come if I wanted to. If I didn't like it, I need never go again. She wouldn't be offended. If I didn't want to try it, that would also be okay. But, well, I've seem to have carried this on all my life. Whatever is offered, I tend to try, unless it's something that I think is really not on. And so I said, yes, I would like to go with her. And I found it so wonderfully peaceful. And they were such lovely people that I continued going long after I left her. I continued going to meeting houses in London, and I was also later on, when I say later on, when I had to stop work, I had to stop school when I was 14 because the Quaker organization who helped to pay for my keep, school leaving age was 14 and they had limited funds, so I had to start going to work. But right up to my marriage, and also during the time during the war when I evacuated myself to Oxford, I would go to meeting houses because it was like a sort of meditation and peace and wonderful people.
Did you have any responsibilities while you were living with her?
No, I think she was mostly concerned that I would adjust and that I would cope with the language and cope with being away from home. She didn't, I don't remember her putting any responsibility on me whatsoever. I think I felt very grateful to her. I hope I felt very grateful to her. And I think I hope that I showed it.
Do you recall any particular problems that arose, being separated from your parents?
Well, I know that there were quite a few times I cried myself to sleep because my parents, although they wrote, not all the letters that they wrote, I didn't receive all the letters they wrote. I think quite a lot must have been intercepted. But there was also a time when I heard for quite some time very little from my mother, and that worried me a lot. And my mother, in fact, was imprisoned in July '39. She never knew why, but during that time she couldn't contact me, and my father didn't tell me, thank goodness he didn't tell me that she was in prison, but it meant she couldn't contact me, and I was very close to her, and I felt there was something not right. So I remember being uneasy, but you know, I can't recall more than that.
What seemed to be the prevalent attitude toward Jews in England at that time?
I think part of it curiosity, part of it we were considered strange. Britain was very insular, much, when I say was, Britain is still to a certain extent very insular, but at that time, you know, Devon and Cornwall are two counties next door to each other, and there were still quite a lot of people, even at that time, who considered that that the people in the other county were foreigners. So somebody from across the sea would be even more, much more a foreigner. In the school that I went to in Falmouth, I had to pass an exam to get into high school, into grammar school, which was the same exam that I would have had to sit had I arrived in time to do the 11 plus, and which would then have meant that I would have had free schooling. Unfortunately, I was 12, and so schooling had to be paid for. But I was at grammar school, and I was looked upon in Falmouth as a curiosity. I came to see my parents during the summer vacation. I never went back to Falmouth because the bombing started in Falmouth before it started anywhere else probably as a result of this wonderful U-boat crew that had been entertained. And so the Quaker organization in London found a place for me in Letchworth with a couple where he was a Quaker and she was Church of England, and they already had one Jewish refugee child, Ruth, with them, and they had 3 children of their own. And in that school, both Ruth and I at different times found stink bombs in our lockers, and we were called German spies and so on, because this was 41, you know, 40, 41, the height of the war, where we were looked upon very much with suspicion, yes. But I think we dealt with all those. Obviously, we were upset if we were looked upon with suspicion, but I think so much was a feeling of survival, of we've got out of there, that whatever happened in England couldn't be as bad as if we hadn't been able to leave. And of course in later years we recognized what a debt we really had to England, on the one hand. On the other hand, also certain resentment that not more people's lives could have been saved if countries would have recognized what was going on. And I can't believe that they really didn't know or knew so little. I think it was just, I personally think it was a fear of different governments of having people who they may have a responsibility, a financial responsibility to. Although everybody I know who came over from as a refugee from Germany has worked hard, has used whatever education they managed to get, and have made, some of them have made wonderful contributions to the countries to which they have gone. But I think that there was, I know that there was a great reluctance of governments all over the world to take in refugees.
You mentioned that you found out later that one of your friends was actually living near you in England. Did you know of any others, have any contact with any of your friends from England, from Germany while you were in England?
No, in fact, this person I also hadn't been a friend in Germany. She had been on the same Kindertransport. She had also come out on she was one of the 100 children. She had also come out on the 23rd of May. And as I say, I only know the date. I'd completely forgotten the date, but I only know the date since the refugee committee, the Jewish Refugee Committee, gave me back my visa form, my permit to come into England, which has the stamp. It's stamped Harwich, 23rd of May. So, no, I can't, I mean, I obviously had friends in Berlin, but none of us really kept in contact. I've met quite a lot of people since who were refugees from Berlin or from different parts of Germany. I mean, amongst my circle of friends are people from Cologne, people from Frankfurt, people from many parts of Germany who came over either 36, 37 still with their parents, or who came over as refugees in 1939.
Did you tell anyone in England about what was happening in Germany?
Well, I did when I first came, but because of the reaction that people thought this was just me wanting to make myself sound interesting, I soon shut up.
How long were you apart from your parents?
From May until, well, it actually continued, but I saw my mother in August 39, and then my father came over, but I never really lived with them for any length of time, because when they came over, they lived in one room, and then there was the fear of my father being interned in England, because there was internment at the beginning of the war. And again, it was only my mother who managed, through her cleverness, to stop my father from being interned, because there was total chaos in England when the war first started. And any male in any Jewish household would be picked up and would be together in camps with Germans who were what I call real Germans, who were either here on holiday or here in England on holiday or in England on business, and they would all be herded together in one camp. It wasn't until several weeks into the war that the British government decided to classify aliens as A, B, and C. And C were Jews who'd come over to England to save their lives, and they were considered friendly aliens. And they then stopped interning Jewish males. But by that time, it was already too late for many who'd been sent to Australia, amongst other places. But as I say, it didn't happen to my father through my mother.
Before your parents came over to England, did anything happen to them as a result of sending you away? Were there any kind of consequences?
No, there were no consequences to sending me away, because before you could go, you had to get permission to leave. So permission had been granted for me to leave. But we had a pretty awful raid on our house, which I touched on earlier in 1935. And in 1935, although Hitler had been in power for a couple of years, life hadn't changed all that much. But one evening, when my father was at a meeting, my mother had come home, and there was a bashing on our front door. Both my sister and I were already asleep. And it was a whole load of brown shirts who said they wanted to, I mean, my mother wouldn't let them in, and they said they wanted to tell her something about my father, that who they knew had gone to a meeting, and they wanted to tell her about that, that something had happened to him. She didn't believe them, rushed upstairs to get to the phone, by which time they'd broken down the front door and were rushing after her and tore the phone out of her hand, and then they said that they'd broken in because she had some documents, some important documents buried in the garden. Total fabrication, but my mother gave them spades and made them dig in the garden, whilst she was put in the corner of our hall, and 3 of them had rifles trained on her. I apparently came downstairs, I don't remember this bit, and said that it was disgusting that they woke children in the middle of the night, but my mother told me that that's what I said. My sister had hid in a cupboard. But they kept these guns, these rifles trained on my mother. They then went into the cellar and helped themselves to wine and played Nazi songs on the piano until about 3 o'clock in the morning. Again, the vision of rifles being trained on my mother, I will never go out of my head. My mother complained to the police, and in those days you still could, and we actually got police protection for about 6 months, because these so-called brown shirts weren't even brown shirts. They had stolen the uniforms and were doing this for fun. And so the police had some sympathy with the fact that this had happened, and we had police protection. But as I say, these sort of, I'm sure there were lots of incidents. I mean, when we had blackout practices, again, there was a lot of tension. Nobody put on an electric light because you sat by candlelight, because you were frightened that they would come in and say there was a chink of light, and you couldn't say no, there wasn't. So you protected yourself by just having a few candles here and there. It was a feeling of anxiety, tension, which was also very stressful it was very stressful in every family, and stressful in the relationships between my parents, and stressful with us as children who obviously wouldn't understand it all, but just knew something awful was happening.
How were your parents able to leave Germany to go to England?
Well, my mother had, as I say, she had as a last resort tickets for China. And I'm afraid I always mention my mother because my father was a most wonderful doctor who was loved by his patients. But to him, medicine was everything, and he really didn't concern himself with very much else. He didn't understand, or maybe didn't want to understand anything much else. And it was my mother who was the driving force in the family. And I don't know, I know that she had managed to smuggle some money out to England. Again, each adult had to have £250, which if you multiply by 33 is a hell of a lot of money. Had to have £250 in England to be allowed in, and somehow I think she got that out. But when I didn't hear from her when she was in prison, I asked her what had actually happened. I asked her that when I was many years later, when I was about 15, 16, and she told me that she never knew why she'd been imprisoned. It could have been because I had written postcards, and on the first postcard I explained that if you put a little cross, a little X, it meant a kiss. But after the first time, I didn't explain it, so sometimes I put 2 crosses and sometimes I put 5 crosses and so on. And it could be that they thought this was a code. We'll never know. But anyway, my mother was extremely good looking and very petite and smart. And the commandant who interrogated her in prison fancied her and said that if she slept with him, she would get out of prison. And she said, well, you get me a ticket for England for my husband and for me, and an open ticket, and a visa to get out of Germany. And when I'm released, the night after I'm released, I will sleep with you. That's her story. Frankly, I don't know whether she did or she didn't, and I couldn't care less because she survived and managed to get my father out. He provided her with those tickets. My mother was released. She took a taxi from the prison to our house in the Königsallee in Grunewald, gave my father his ticket and said, I'm going straight to the airport. And she arrived literally just in the clothes in which she stood up. And that if this man came to claim her, as it were, he should say that she's had a nervous breakdown and that she was in a sanatorium. Unfortunately, I haven't got the postcards this man sent her. I don't know what happened to them, but he actually sent postcards to the house in Berlin, which my father forwarded, postcards, open postcards, which finished up with Heil Hitler. And this was just in the beginning, you know, just before the war. But anyway, much of the story must be true, because otherwise, you know, not that I doubted the truth, but the part, whether she did or she didn't, as I say, to me is immaterial, because I think everybody did what they had to do, as long as it didn't hurt anybody else, to save their own skins.
What was your father allowed to take out of the country with him?
Well, I think, I mean, you were allowed to send what was called a lift, which is a container, of furniture and so on. And I think that's what my mother asked my father to see to the final sending of it. I don't think it ever actually got sent in time before the war broke out, because my father literally arrived with an umbrella. I mean, he arrived with an attaché case and an umbrella, and the furniture never came. So whether it was intercepted or whether but furniture is things, and none of us cared about those. The important thing was human beings. And my father was eventually, I mean, at first when my father came to England, he became a porter in the Cumberland Hotel in London, and not even a porter taking people up and down, but taking the garbage up and down. And eventually, after the war had started, when they were short of doctors, my father was allowed to work in a military hospital. The British Medical Association in London had put an embargo on doctors setting themselves up to work from 1936 onwards, unless they passed the British exams. My father, as I say, this was 1939. He wasn't far off 60, and he just didn't feel he could go through this whole business of an examination. And as I say, it was after the beginning of the war, he was allowed to work as a doctor in a military hospital, which had patients from the First World War as well as the Second World War. And then after the war, he set up in his own surgery. He set up his own surgery in Kilburn, again a working class part of London, and worked under the health service, which had then started. But that's how they both came out.
Do you know what happened to the rest of your belongings that were left in Germany?
No, I know that the house was taken by a Nazi who subsequently was in the army and fell at what was then called Stalingrad. His heirs sold the house to somebody who kept bicycles. These are all things that I've heard since, of course. He kept the whole house full of bicycles. And then when restitution started in the 50s, my parents got the house back in a terrible state, and my mother was terribly worried at that time. It was in, I think it must have been around 55, 56. She was terribly worried that, I mean, it was in the, I think it was in the American zone, because Berlin was divided into 4 zones. But the Cold War was raging, and there was a rumor put about that the Russians were going to take over the whole of Berlin, and which of course never happened. But my mother sold the house for a ridiculously low sum of money, because she was afraid that if she didn't do it immediately, she would lose it altogether. Since then, I have been in the house. The house was bought by a solicitor, and in 1985 I took my younger daughter Julia to Berlin, and we went into the house. In 1990 I went at the invitation of the mayor of Berlin, and I took some friends into the house. And in 1995, by which time the solicitor who bought it had died, but his children had taken it over, I went into the house again with my older daughter and son-in-law, Sandra and Dennis, to show them the type of house that I'd grown up in, which was very important for both of them to have seen, for both my children to have seen, and I took some photographs.
Did your parents ever move back to Germany after the war?
No. My parents, in spite of the fact that, well, neither of them really ever acclimatized. Both of them spoke with pretty awful accents, but neither of them could ever think. My mother was the one who went back to deal with any of the restitution, but I went with her a couple of times because she found it extremely difficult to go back because of her memories. And I have to say, when the first time I went back, we landed at Tempelhof, which is now only used as a military airport, but at that time was also for civilians. And when my sister left for America, she left from that airport. And that was the last time I'd been at Tempelhof Airport until I arrived again with my mother. And all the memories came back of that day when we took my sister and her husband to the airport, and they took my sister. My mother had made her sandwiches, and they took my sister away to go right through the sandwiches and right through all the cotton wool she had with her in case she was smuggling something out. And my sister was gone quite a long time, and my mother was standing next to me, and she was standing very straight, and suddenly here she was standing like a straight candle, and she just went without bending or anything. That candle went straight back in a complete faint. And again, that's a memory I will never forget, and that was the airport that we went to the first time we came back to Berlin.
Do you know if any other children ever saw their parents again?
Yes, some of my friends have seen their parents again, others haven't. I have one friend who told me only recently that her parents had told, she came with the Kindertransport, she was 3 years older than I, and her parents had told her that she was going on a journey to England, and it was going to be a lovely holiday, and they would see her soon. And it wasn't until the train was pulling out. She came from Cologne. It wasn't until the train pulled out, and in Cologne both parents were allowed to come to the station. And she saw her father supporting her mother, who had broken down, that she suddenly thought, hey, what is this? I thought I was going on a wonderful holiday, and I was going to see my parents. Why is my mother crying? Why does my father look so sad? And I think very slowly it dawned on her that it really was a journey where she may never see them. And so it was. They both died.
Do you know what happened to your parents' families?
Yes, my father's sister was taken to Theresienstadt, where she died. Theresienstadt was a concentration camp. My uncle, the husband of my father's sister, the story I heard is that he had managed to get onto a boat to South America and was not allowed to land. This has been well documented, and I think that part is true. I have never quite found out. My cousin, their son, is alive, and I have asked him, and I'm afraid I can't remember what he said, because the memory of what my parents had told me is too stark. They were turned back, and the ship came back, and before it docked in Hamburg, he threw himself overboard and committed suicide. Their son lived in Switzerland during the war because he got his sister had tuberculosis and was in a sanatorium, And although the children were not supposed to mix because she had the very infectious TB, they did mix. She died and he got TB, but in a way one could say it saved his life because he lived in Davos in the sanatorium, and I'm glad to say is alive now and lives in Switzerland, and we're very fond of each other. My husband came from Lithuania, and the Germans marched into Lithuania, I think it was in 41, and were welcomed with open arms, so I understand, by the Lithuanians. And my husband's father was left-wing and was taken and disappeared. Never, to this day, I'm still trying to find out what happened to him. His mother was taken into a ghetto. She was spirited out of the ghetto by some Gentile friends who hid her right through the war, and she went back into the ghetto every week, every Friday. We know this from a person who was with her right at the end. She came every Friday dressed up as a peasant woman and brought some bread and some food to some of her friends. How she managed this, I'll never know, because the food that she had, I mean, as she was hidden, she can't have had a ration card. But anyway, that's what she did every week. And in 1944, just before the Russian advance, one of the women in the ghetto denounced her. And she was taken, and she told the friend who told us the story, who was with her till almost the last minute, that she was afraid she might not be able to withstand the torture, to tell them who had hidden her, to tell the Germans who had hidden her. And also she knew she was going to die anyway. And so she had a capsule on her. Her husband had also been a pharmacist, and she had a capsule on her and committed suicide. And as I said, this was told to me by a woman who herself was in the camp, in the ghetto. And then when the Russians advanced, they took everybody who was able-bodied on a boat back to Germany. Now this woman's daughter got ill on the boat, and they just took her and threw her overboard in front of the mother, because anybody who wasn't well was just disposed of. So.
Do you know why she was denounced by another woman in the ghetto?
Well, I suppose because she couldn't bring food to 2,000 people who were in the ghetto. And I've always said one has to forgive people in these circumstances. The woman was probably starving. Who knows? We never found that out, no.
In which ghetto was that?
That was in Kaunas, or Kovno. Kaunas is spelled K-A-U-N-U-S, and Kovno K-O-V-N-O, so whichever, both mean the same thing.
After the war ended, did you go back to Germany, or did you stay in England?
I stayed in England and would certainly never live in Germany. I have been back several times. I have some very close friends who are quite a bit younger than I am in Germany, and particularly in the part that had been East Berlin. People I met in the mid and late 60s when we were camping with the children, who've become very close. I could never see myself living in Germany, because I do look at anybody of a certain age with a great deal of suspicion. And it might be that I am particularly sensitive, but when I've been on a bus in Berlin, it has happened that somebody who said he was war wounded asked me to get up and give him a seat because the bus was full. Well, he could have asked a lot of much younger men, but he didn't. He chose me, and I couldn't help but think that this was, again, anti-Semitism. On the other hand, I was too afraid, being again in Berlin, to do anything other than jump up and give him my seat. It was like a knee-jerk reaction. I did it without thinking twice, because that's how you behaved in the pre-war years. So I certainly, and neither could my parents ever have gone back to Germany, and I settled well in England, and I've been perfectly happy in England. I raised my family there.
Were you able to continue your education after the war?
No. I had to stop my education at 14 because there was no money to pay for it, and unfortunately, because I couldn't do the exams at the correct age, I couldn't continue with my education. So I was apprenticed to dressmaking at the age of 14 and a half, which I did for many years. I got married when I was just 19, and my husband, being Lithuanian and having come over as a student, and when the war started, his parents couldn't continue sending money for his studies, so he had started an engineering degree, but had not finished it. The jobs he got, he did not pay particularly well, and I've always worked, but I worked dressmaking from home until the children were old enough for me to feel that I could work part-time. I had also had a secretarial training. I got myself a secretarial training when I was 15, and so I managed to, through a friend who had a cousin who ran an art gallery, to do secretarial work and help in an art gallery from 1963, when my daughter Sandra was 13 and Julia was 10. From 1963 to 67, I helped in the art gallery. From 67 till 72, I was with the United Nations Association, and where my knowledge of language, of course, helped. And from 1972 until I retired in 1990, I worked with the Citizens Advice Bureau Association, which is an organization that helps to obtain and, as it were, teach people their rights. We have over 1,000 offices all over the country. It's a voluntary organization, but there are certain people who are, when I say certain people, in London it was very much, it had to be a paid job, since most people need to be, I certainly needed to be paid because I had to help the family finances. And so I worked in Islington, running a Citizens Advice Bureau, and it is the knowledge of that which is now hopefully of use to the Jewish Refugee Committee, because I have a knowledge of housing problems, of benefit problems, of trying to understand complicated legislation and trying to make it understandable to people. And so I'm working with World Jewish Relief and the Jewish Refugee Committee, still helping to get Jews out of Chechnya, out of Russia, out of Bosnia, who need to claim political asylum in Britain. And I'm very grateful that I'm given the opportunity to give something back to an organization that helped so many people.
When you attended the reunion of the Kindertransport, how did it feel to meet with those children who are now adults?
It was an incredible, the whole thing had an incredible aura. We had some marvelous speakers, and I think we all felt really like a large family. We all came together from completely different backgrounds, from completely different experiences over the previous 50, 60 years. But the common denominator was the way our lives had been saved. And I think every one of us was very grateful to be, and felt very privileged that an organization had helped to get us all together, and I think it was quite therapeutic for many of us. I think it's only as you get older and have time to think that you can deal with the pain. I know that I certainly didn't think a great deal about it whilst I was raising my children. I think we all had, or many of us were too busy just getting on with seeing to it that our children would get the best education they could for their abilities. I think to Jewish people, possibly more than to any others, but maybe I'm wrong, education is of prime importance because it's the one thing that can't be taken from you. What's in your head is there, and is there to help you. And my mother made both of us learn all kinds of things that children from our background, which, as I say, was very middle class, many children never learned in their homes. But my mother said, you never ask anybody else to do something that you couldn't do yourself. My mother would show my sister how the coal would be shoveled into the, what is now of course totally old-fashioned central heating system. We would do the family ironing. We would do anything that was necessary in the household. The one thing my mother never taught me was to cook. But everything else in the household, she insisted that we knew and could do. And I think that's a very important lesson in life. You don't ask people to do things that you're not prepared to do, not prepared or able to do yourself. And I think my life with my husband, my husband was quite ill early on, I think again as a result of experiences he'd had, and so fending for the family and helping for the finances was always part of my life, and I think part of most people's lives, to the extent that you pushed aside any thoughts of what had been or what might have been. And I think, you know, many people ask, why is so much said now about the Holocaust? Why are there so many memories coming up now for people? And the only way that I can explain it is that I think we all need to document what happened so that it doesn't get forgotten with the next generation or generations. And also because as you get to retirement, that's when you start being able to relax. Your children are adults, you've done everything you could for them, they're on their own, and you sit back and you think back of your life. And then all kinds of memories come, which then become difficult to deal with. And I think that must be the experience of many, and those people with whom I've talked about it, we all seem to feel the same. We are now allowing these emotions free rein, because there's nothing wrong with crying over a time where an awful lot of people's tears were shed and whom nobody helped. And we are the reminder, and I think have a duty to the people who died such untimely deaths, to get as much of our experiences told in the hope that this will never happen again. Unfortunately, we've seen not so long ago and are still seeing ethnic cleansing, as it's now called, and to a large extent, I suppose people never learn. But I do think that the Holocaust experience is, and I don't want this to sound, I can't think of the right word, it isn't, I think it is unique, and the reason why I think that is unique is because I don't think that there's ever been a time where there has been such systematic, organized murder. Only recently I went to a museum in Beit Shalom in England, near Nottingham, which was started and is run by a British Methodist, quite young, who, when he read theology, found nothing was ever mentioned about the Holocaust, and so he decided to dig a bit deeper, and as a result he has started this Holocaust memorial. And I went there with somebody from Germany only a few months ago, and there was a woman who spoke, who had been in a concentration camp, and she showed us something I have never seen before. It was a document that she had managed to get hold of that detailed how much it cost to keep a Jew in a concentration camp and how much could be earned when they were dead, of their skin, of their hair, of the gold in their teeth. And that is the most graphic description of the way that we were looked at, as it cost so much to feed us, but against that you could earn that much to sell us to make bars of soap.
How did you feel when the mayor of Berlin invited you back?
I knew that every mayor of every town in Germany was inviting children back who they called the children of, whether it was Berlin in my case, or Cologne and others, or Frankfurt or whatever, and that it was a journey they wanted us to make, which was part of their guilt. I managed to persuade some friends to come as well. She was also from Berlin. Her mother had died in a concentration camp. She herself had been in a concentration camp, and she tells me she was, the memory she has is being pulled out of the gas chamber when the Americans had arrived. And her memories are such that she has not told her children about them because she can't. And she had never been back to Germany, and I managed to persuade her to come to Berlin because she wanted to put a plaque in memory of her mother in the synagogue from which she and her twin brother had been torn from the mother, who was then sent to a different concentration camp and perished. And they came with me, she and her husband, who was English, Jewish English. They came with me, and that was the only circumstance under which she was prepared to come. She was not prepared to take any of the pocket money that the mayor, or was given to us in the name of the mayor, to enjoy ourselves in Berlin. She donated to a charity because she didn't want any of the money which she considered was guilt money. It is guilt money. I'm afraid I consider that anything they give to make the lives of those they harmed easier is not enough, and does not absolve their guilt. But I'm afraid I have accepted money from them, feeling that it is mine of right. I would have had a very, very different life. I'm not saying I would have been any happier. I don't know. Who knows what the future brings? But I would have had a very different life. I would have had an education, and I've had a chip on my shoulder all my life that I didn't go to university. It wasn't until the mid-70s that I got rid of a little bit of that chip by being asked by the organization with which I worked to do a postgraduate diploma in advice and information, a course that had just started. Now, I was the only non-graduate to do a postgraduate diploma, and I had to sit an exam before I was allowed to get on the course to see whether I was capable of doing the course, and I came out of it with flying colors. And since then, that chip has become a little smaller, but I think whatever reparations the Germans pay, we should accept, do with it what we want to do with it. If we want to give it to a charity, fine. If we want to enjoy life a bit more than we could otherwise, fine. But I think nothing will ever absolve their guilt. But I have absolutely no conscience about anything they offer. So if you ask me how did I feel, I felt, well, they're inviting me back. I know this is a promotion tour, as it were. They did it extremely well. I had a very nice woman. Each person that went has somebody detailed to them who looks after them and who talks with them and takes them to the various memorials. And I must say that was extremely well done. And the person who took me was a charming woman who sadly since died of cancer. She and her husband, both of them not Jewish, had gone to Israel, and as a result of their visit to Israel had both gone into fields to, like this woman was now helping with Jews who came to be shown Germany as it now is. They were doing that as a penance, I'm sure. They felt they needed to, they wanted to give something to people who had been, whose future had been totally changed. And as I say, this woman in fact told me about the son of the woman who ran the Goldschmidt-Schule, and that's how I got that book about my school. And as I say, she was wonderful, and I feel if they offer you to see Germany, go and see Germany. It is different from the way it was, but I'm afraid I will never look at any German over a certain age without wondering what the hell did you do? On the other hand, I also know that there were some wonderful people, like my nurse, my father's receptionist, like the people who helped my husband's mother. There were many, many, what we now call unsung heroes, because people were risking their lives to do this.
Have you seen any other friends from your hometown in Berlin since leaving Germany?
No.
What have you told your children or grandchildren about the Holocaust?
Everything. My children asked questions, whatever questions they asked, I answered to the best of my ability. My late husband was Jewish, but an agnostic. I'm an agnostic. We sadly didn't bring our children up traditionally, which I now wish we had, but we didn't. But they know about the traditions. My grandchildren have all had to do essays at school about the grandparents, and I've been interviewed by all my grandchildren. I have 4. The eldest is now 22 and the youngest is nearly 19. And they've asked me, and I've answered all their questions. I went with my daughter and son-in-law, with one daughter, Sandra, and son-in-law to the Imperial War Museum last May, who had then opened the Holocaust Museum. A section of that museum is now the Holocaust Museum in London. And there was a film about the Kindertransport at the Imperial War Museum, which I showed them, which they saw, and I've since bought a copy, and they saw. And they've also seen the film that came out recently, Into the Arms of Strangers, which is about the Kindertransport. It's been fortunate for me that I wasn't so badly scarred that I could talk about it, and I hope it was fortunate for my children. They've both begged me to write my life story, which I have started, and thought that I would, in my originally intended 2 months and now 4 months stay in the States to get down on the computer, because I have actually managed to write most of it, but it's in longhand. But I don't know where the time has gone. I have not managed to get it down yet, but I will do so, because they really want that, and they had asked their father to write his life story, and that was 22 years ago. He died about a year after they asked him whether he would write about it. But as I say, it was really, certainly, it only came to my knowledge about 20, 25 years ago that people were now starting to talk about their experiences. And my husband didn't get very far, and so now I'm being nagged. Please get it down before it's too late. And this interview will also help them to understand. So good God.
This is part 2 of an interview with Vera Coppard on Sunday, March 4th, 2001, at the Virginia Holocaust Museum in Richmond, Virginia. Are there any other ways that the Holocaust changed your life?
I think the Holocaust has changed the lives of anybody it touched. There are different interpretations of the word Holocaust. I always thought that when somebody described me as a Holocaust survivor, I said, I'm not a Holocaust survivor. I was not in a camp. I wasn't in Germany during the war. I have no right to call myself a Holocaust survivor. And it was put to me very strongly that that was quite wrong, because anybody who survived in whatever way and in whatever place, any of the experiences they had under fascism, is a Holocaust survivor, because the word survivor also means that you didn't go under, you kept fighting. And I think that was borne out by, in England. It was very often the Jewish children in schools that excelled in class. That set up quite a few problems. And it would be, well, of course, all you people, you're all intelligent. It had nothing to do with that. It had to do with the fact you wanted to prove yourself. You wanted to be as good as everybody else around you, and as whatever you were being taught was in a foreign language. Of course you did your homework when others might have said, oh, let's forget it, because all this wasn't so important. It wasn't so important to an English person to be accepted because they were accepted. If you were a refugee, you wanted to do everything. Obviously, I can only speak for myself, but I also speak for those with whom I talked about all these times. You wanted to be accepted. You wanted to be as good as. You didn't want to be better, and you weren't any better. You just might have worked a bit harder because you needed to be accepted. I think in that way, maybe the Holocaust has made those who have survived it push harder, fight harder, to do the most they can, both in the field of wanting to do well themselves in order to show they're as good as anybody else, and also perhaps in the professions. I think it's no accident that I went into a field where I could help other people. I've always worked with people, and in my days in the United Nations Association, I was in charge of young people between school and university going on to work camps in countries all over the world, an exchange. Now, why did I do this? If I thought about it, maybe it was because I wanted to promote some sort of international understanding, but that sounds very grand. I don't suppose I thought about it, but it came naturally. I went into the Citizens Advice Bureau service because I was always interested in law. At one time in my youth I wanted to study medicine, at another time I wanted to study law. And in fact law has been something that I now wish I had studied, but by the time that I decided that, I was already well in my 40s, and it would have meant studying without bringing anything into the household as far as helping with the finances were concerned. But I think to most of us, what it has done, it has made us want to do the best we can in whatever field we are working.
If you've not already shared your most vivid memory, could you describe it?
If
you've not shared your most vivid memory.
I think the most vivid memory I can recall is the one that I have mentioned, with rifles pointing at my mother. I think there are so many instances. I have to say they're all related to my mother. When my father was going to be interned, I had another guarantor in London, and my mother, and this was during the vacation, and the vacation in 1939, my mother rang me and said, would I come to their room in my Girl Guide uniform? My mother was very proud of my being a Girl Guide. Again, I think this was because she felt I must have been accepted. Anyway, I didn't know why she wanted me to come over. I came over on a Saturday morning, and my father was in bed and looked absolutely terrible. And then the police came to take my father to be interned, but in England you have a right to go to a court. Everybody who was to be interned went to a court first to explain why they shouldn't be, and most people they went ahead and were interned. Anyway, my mother went instead of my father because my father seemed to be too ill, and she showed the two policemen who came to fetch him that he was lying in bed looking grey. It turned out my mother went to the court and talked non-stop in her dreadful English, and the judge just said, oh, deferred for the time being. I think he was trying to get rid of her. But what she'd actually done during the night, they had been told on the day before that my father would be collected the next day. And the authorities had informed my parents. So my mother asked me to sit by my father's bed in my Girl Guide uniform because she had asked him in the middle of the night, she'd woken him and asked him to make her a cup of tea. And he had a cup of tea himself. And she slipped some heavy sleeping drugs into his tea. So in the morning, he looked absolutely dreadful. And when they came to pick him up, she said, well, look, my husband has heart problems. If you want to take it, be it on your head if something happens to him. And of course, they didn't take him. My father had a heart as strong as an ox, but this was typical of my mother, and these are the memories that I hold, because they really are of an extraordinary person.
What one lesson do you think we should learn from remembering the Holocaust?
Man's inhumanity to man. I think a lesson we'll never learn, that we are all equal, that no one is better than anybody else, and no one has the right to take life or dictate or push their views on anyone else, or that they consider themselves better than the next person. A lesson I'm afraid we don't appear to have learned.
How do you explain to children what happened?
With great difficulty, because fortunately children growing up in today's world, many of them are fortunate in that they have not only all the necessities of life, but are offered all the good things in life. And I think it must be incredibly difficult for them to try and comprehend. And I think all we can do is show them films of what happened, because visual things seem to stay much more in their minds nowadays than reading. But how little children really understand was brought home to me some years ago, when my then, I think he was about 12-year-old grandson was in my flat, and I have a very nice flat. In one corner I have, it looks like a cupboard, but it is actually a wash basin around which I've had some carpentry that it looks as if it were a cupboard. And he opened it and he saw it was a wash basin, and he said, "Why do you keep a wash basin in your room?" And I said, "Well, I have a very nice flat, but the day may come when I can't afford it, and I may have to let a room in my flat. And I only have one bathroom, and then I can wash in my bedroom." And my grandson looked at me absolutely aghast, and he said, "Grandma, you wouldn't share your kitchen or your bathroom with a stranger?" And I realized then how little perception children have, because when we had our first house in 1953, for the first 10 years, we had somebody live. The children each had a bedroom. It was a 3-bedroomed house, and the 3rd bedroom, the largest one, we let to help pay the mortgage. And we slept in what actually was supposed to be a dining room, but it could easily be a dining room. I mean, we could eat in the kitchen and morning room, but if we had too many people, we could make our bedroom into a dining room. But as I say, children nowadays, most of them, are totally unaware of what one actually can do, what one has to. And of course we don't want them ever to be in that situation, but I think it's important that they know that it can happen, and that there are people nowadays who have very little money and are not in as good a position as they are. But as I say, in terms of understanding, I think one can tell children, but I think one has to be very careful to do it in small doses, and not so that they feel that you're preaching, or because, as I say, why should they be able to understand? The visual does help.
How do you answer people who say that it never happened?
How do I answer them? Unfortunately, I've never been in the position to have to answer them because I don't come across such people. I think they have warped minds. I think they, yeah, I think that's all I can say, that they have totally warped minds and want to pretend that it never happened for their own particular purposes. It's totally beyond my own comprehension that anybody could not see that this was a black spot in history, that one must take care it doesn't happen again. But you don't take care of that by pretending it never happened.
Do you see any dangers in America or England or other parts of the world today?
I think fascism raises its ugly head in all countries every now and then. If you have high unemployment, then there is envy of those who have by those who have not, and you need a scapegoat. And I'm quite sure I know we have a certain amount of anti-Semitism in England, and I think we would have a great deal more anti-Semitism in England if we didn't have an anti-black feeling, or we would have more open anti-Semitism because, as I say, it's more directed against black people in England. I think every country, every now and then, feels it needs its scapegoats. There's a fascist party in England, but it hasn't had much of a chance. It's very difficult in a democracy because how do you answer why should you stop a meeting of fascists if you don't object to a meeting of communists? People sort of see it in relation to that. And if you live in a democracy where there is free speech, it's difficult to answer why some so-called free speech should be suppressed. As I say, anybody who says this never happened, I think, is deranged. But it's an easy answer to say they're deranged, but I would like to know their motivation, why they go against everything that can be proven to them.
Do you have any last memory that you'd like to share?
Do I have any?
Another memory that you would like to share?
No, I think I've given you most of them. And I'm very grateful for this interview because, again, as I say, it's a very, very small way of leaving something behind. So that not too many people can say, well, did it really ever happen? Because if they can see that people talk about it, what has happened to them, and hopefully people don't look at these films and think, oh, well, that's somebody showing off. Hopefully it will leave some memory in people when they come across anti-anything.
And thank you for sharing your experiences.
Thank you.